So let's get started with making these diagrams. We previously put the image into the document and placed it on the image underlay layer. I also had drawn a rectangle, which now I want to select. And you can see when I'm clicking on this edge, I'm getting the option to either pick up the curve, which is my rectangle, or the surface, which is my image. So I definitely want to pick up the curve. I'm going to click on the curve to select that. And now I want to copy that curve, that basically this frame, onto each of my layers so that I have a frame that I'm working with before I lock that Culper object. So I have the object selected, and if I left click on the rotational clamp, I can copy object to this layer. By copying it, I'm going to duplicate it on several layers. And then I'm going to move to the anchor, copy the object on this layer, and the radial field, copy the object on this layer. And so that should suffice to give me a kind of frame that I'm going to use. Now I'm going to go and lock the underlay layer, and now if I try to move around on that Culper layer, I'm going to move the entire screen rather than moving the image. So that works great. If I want to turn it off, I can. If I want to turn off the layers that I'm not working on, I can also do that. I think what I want to do is put in my regulating lines and axes first, so that those can act as guides when I come to develop the objects later. So let's go ahead and select as our active layer the regulating lines and axes for the rotational clamp. So recall, I'm calling this device here my rotational clamp. What are the regulating lines? What are the kind of conditions of order that I can find within this? I might describe its axes around some of these radii that construct the object. I might construct its edges, and that's more what I have in mind for you guys to complete as your regulating lines, is a set of lines that are really sort of important in the construction of the object. So let's just go ahead and draw a couple of those lines that are the defining lines of this object, and that will help us later to construct the actual rotational clamp. So right now, while I'm placing the regulating lines, I know in this composition that my regulating lines are not orthographically regular. They're not at the 90-degree angles. If I select the line tool, you can see it's really allowing me to go vertical or horizontal. But if I come and click off the ortho snaps, I can go in any direction. So that's really what I want to do for these lines. So now you can see I've drawn a set of lines around the rotational clamp, and if I make the background invisible, you'll be able to see those lines a little bit better. They're not perfect, but they are really kind of the guiding lines that describe the geometry of that figure. So what I want to do now, because these are regulating lines, what I'm interested in is the way in which the object might begin to influence the logic or the ordering of things in proximity to it. So I'm not just interested in the outside shape, I'm really interested in this edge as a line which may continue its logic into the space around it. So in order to do that, right now it's more describing the edge of the object. So what I'd like to do is extend those lines into the field in order to sort of see where they might implicate other locations. To do that, I'm going to use the extend command. So if I type in extend, I can do it that way, and I simply will pick the end of that line, and you'll see that now as I try to extend it, it's allowing me to sort of move out to the edge of the composition, but it's not changing the angle. If I had simply grabbed the end handle of the line, the angle would have been changing at the same time. So it's also allowing me to snap to the intersection. You can see that it's saying, yes, you've reached the intersection. And so I'm going to snap that in place, and I've extended. I want to do that in both directions. Oops, grabbed the wrong one. So I want to do that for each of these lines. This little one is really more local. It doesn't have a big dramatic effect. So, but I do want these longer lines. I want to see kind of where they go. And you don't have to grab them exactly by the end. This will help Rhino know that you want, you know, if I grab a little bit away from that corner, it'll help it know that I want these longer lines rather than the shorter lines. So I'm going to click those ones. I'll probably go ahead and extend these lines. Maybe I'll go ahead and go up to the top here. Even though really they're a little bit more local, they're shorter. That's why I'm calling them a little bit more local. But I think to get the kind of basic infrastructure in place, I'd still like to have those in the composition. I've got this little short guy. So those are working pretty well. I've got a little bit of an oddball here, and that's actually where this figure is sort of turning the corner. So I may want to later kind of refine that a little bit, but for now I think I'm okay. I want to go ahead and extend these as well off of that clamping device. So those look like some pretty good regulating lines. If I were beginning to think about the importance of the center, for example, if this sort of bar-like device was organizing other elements that basically came on the same axial line, I would put the axis in there. Or if this sort of larger tooth of the clamp was, you know, organizing things along this field, and particularly if they were sort of lining up along the center, I might put an axial line right in the middle of that. But for now, I'm pretty happy with just the edges. And if I turn the visibility back on, you can kind of see again where we're going. Now you'll have noticed that these did not work all that well as straight lines. Really, if I then look more closely, this is more of a curved line. So let's go ahead and draw those a little bit different way. I'm still in my extend command, so I want to escape. I'm going to go ahead and take those two lines out, and instead I'm going to pick a gentle curve. So now when I turn this off, you'll see that those two objects have been created as curving figures rather than straight figures. This little line is really distracting me quite a bit, so I'm going to go ahead and say that's not a regulating line. It seems like more of a minor condition. And I think too I may shorten this and not have it sort of extend. Again, maybe that's a reason to take it off, but I can use my extend command and I can actually shorten things with extend as well. So I can actually use extend sort of like a trimming command. All right, and if I looked at the composition and I noticed that this edge was starting to create logics out in the field, I would definitely extend that. I think I may go ahead and still extend this one. I'm still in my extend command, and I complete that line. So really, I've given myself a set of regulating lines that seem to be pretty clear. I'm wondering a little bit about that condition, but if I turn on the underlay, I see that it really is important. I've got this sort of figure that's changing shape, and I may go ahead and put this one line back in. There are my regulating lines, and you can see how they correspond to the image. And you'll see that this regulating line, if I follow it up, sure enough, it is having an influence on objects outside. And even if we start to think about these regulating lines as being part of a pattern, if we repeat one more time, they begin to describe the edge of this other figure. So really we do see the kind of regulating line beginning to help organize the entire field. So let's go ahead and see how these regulating lines will help us when we're constructing the figure. So if I turn off the image, I can see my regulating lines here. I'm going to begin by copying all of my regulating lines. Actually, I think what I'll do first is lock my frame. And that way, if I'm on this layer and I go in and select everything, I'm not actually getting the frame, which is great. So now I've got all those objects selected. I'm going to go ahead and copy those onto my rotational clamp layer. Remember, I'm right now on my regulating lines layer. I'm going to move to this layer. And what I want to do is make a copy. I don't want to move them. If I move them, they won't be on my other layer anymore. So I want to make a copy of this layer to this layer. Okay, that's great. So now, just for good practice, I'm going to go ahead and turn this off so I won't be editing. Now you can see as I have moved those objects, they became solid lines. And we also know that they're not all important. They are not all continuous when I turn on the image underlay. So for example, these lines are kind of periphery for this figure, and I'm going to want to trim those. So let's see how we can do that. Now a really good tool to use would be the trim tool. So let's go ahead and trim things. Select all my objects and type in the command trim. It's going to let me start editing off bits and pieces. So I can simply click on the pieces I don't want anymore. So these extended lines, they were really important as regulating lines. Now that I'm trying to construct this object, I'm going to want to trim them away. So I just trim that off. I'm going to trim this one off. Now I've actually have two lines that are on the outside of this figure. I'll trim that one. I'll trim that one and that one. I'll trim this little guy. That was slightly unwise because it didn't really intersect with that, but we can fix that in a minute. Trim that one and that one. I like how this is going around. I'm going to trim that one. I'm going to go ahead and trim that one, that one. So now you can see I've gone ahead and left. I didn't trim out the pieces of the other the other part, because these figures, even though I've described them in the same layer, they really are different figures. So I want to keep whole profiles of those objects, of each of those objects. So I actually do want to trim those two because they're really the kind of residue of this piece. I don't really want these guys. They're also a bit of residue. And so you can see what I did when I trimmed this, since they didn't intersect. That wasn't such a good line, and I don't really like the position of that line anyway. So let's go ahead and escape from the trim command. Now everything I do is going to be more of a simple edit. I may just move this over and use my extend command to go ahead and extend those lines to the intersecting points. I don't love the angle. Go ahead and edit that. I'm going to select the curve and move that angle. Okay, so now I want to trim again just to get kind of really clean intersections. And I'm going to zoom in and make sure that that really is a clean corner. And it is, and that that's a clean corner. All right, very good. Let's go ahead and turn off the underlay. Now you can see that by trimming, I've created boundaries for these figures. So you can see that I don't have a very good corner here. And there are other tools that I can use to patch this. I can basically use my extend command that we know about, but I can also use some of these fillet commands. So this fillet will produce a curve. So select the first curve for the fillet. Each of these lines is a curve, and select the second curve. So that gave me kind of a nice connection that's rounded. Do I want to do that for the remaining pieces? Let's look at that underlay again. Actually, some of them are pretty crisp, and others are definitely more curved. So let's go ahead and see. We might want to curve this one. We might want to curve, we've already curved this one. We might want to curve this one. We might want to curve this one. Maybe that one as well. Let's go ahead and keep using that same command and see what kind of effects we can get. Now let's be a little pickier with this one. So I've got this kind of curve that's happening, but it's a much wider radius. So this additional curve is much more specific, and if I were being quite picky, which I want you to be, I would probably move this line over so that it really is tangent to that circle. Here I know that the way that these two lines are filleted has to do with, and you could call that fillet or fillet, it has to do with the radius of this circle. If I enter the fillet command and type in the R, it's asking me for the radius, and if I start in the center of this circle and go to the outside, that's going to be the approximate curve that I want. You want to go kind of slowly, read the commands. What is it asking me? Select the first curve to fillet, U. Select the second curve, U. And look at that. So it gave me a radius that was really much tighter, much more controlled by that circle. All right, so let's see how those objects are looking when I take the background image off. All right, I need to extend this object to the end, and I've got this sort of full frame, which I want. But I also want for these objects to be kind of whole objects. So I'm going to want to connect the objects, the lines, the various parts of the curve, so that they are all connected as a single polyline, closed polyline. So let's look at how that looks. So you can see when I'm connecting, when I'm sort of selecting these objects right now, they're all really separate curves. And I want them to act together. I want them to be joined into a single curve. So I'm going to use the join command. When I'm using my window to select, if I'm dragging to the right, everything that I drag through will be selected, right? So if I drag through there, I get anything that I have touched. When I'm dragging to the left, I only pick up things that I am fully enclosing. So you can see I'm crossing that big bar, but I didn't enclose the entire bar. I only enclosed these little portions of the curve. So if I wanted to pick only these portions of the curve, simply drag around them and I've got only that object. So now if I'm trying to join this together, I'm going to use the join command. Okay, now when I select this, I've got the whole thing, right? I'm not picking one curve at a time. So I want to do the same thing with this object. Now you'll recall I have two curves here, but I don't have anything at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and come up here and close this figure off with a line. And because I'm snapping to my objects, it snapped very cleanly to those lines. If I had a long line and I was trying to trim that, I could also use my trim command. Remember, I'm only getting that end, but if I drag right, everything I touch will be grabbed. So that looks like a closed figure. Let's go ahead and join it. All right, so now I've got one figure and another figure.